Shocking. Trump is becoming a burden for allies. In Europe, they're starting to turn away from the American leader. Politicians who were called his closest allies just yesterday are suddenly changing their tone and publicly distancing themselves from the master of the White House. Even Giorgia Malone unexpectedly put him in his place after a loud statement. But that's not all. While European leaders are moving away from Trump, a new scandal has erupted in the US. The president announced a high-profile act of vandalism near one of America's main symbols. However, journalists found no evidence whatsoever. Is support for Trump turning into a political burden for his allies? And why is there more and more talk in Europe about the toxicity of his name? I'll share all the details in just a moment. Hello, this is Ukraine Today. I'm Solomia Dolik with the latest events. Trump is becoming toxic for allies in Europe. Even the right wing is starting to distance itself. Support for the American leader, which until recently was considered a political bonus for the European right, is increasingly turning into a problem, as political rights due to tariff wars, the conflict over Iran, and scandalous statements by the US president, his allies in Europe are starting to keep their distance. One of the clearest examples is Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Malone, who was long called Trump's main ally in Europe. After his claim that she supposedly begged for photos together at the G7 summit, Malone publicly put him in his place and advised the US president to worry more about his own ratings.
Friendship with Trump certainly didn't help my popularity.
Similar sentiments are being observed in France as well. The leader of the right-wing national rally, Jordan Bardella, called Trump's behavior unpredictable and rejected the idea of supporting him. Sociologists are already calling the American president's support for European nationalists a poisoned gift. Polls show that even among right-wing voters, only a minority considers Trump a friend of Europe. The greatest distancing is noticeable in Italy and Germany, where right-wing forces previously openly sympathized with Trump. At the same time, Polish conservatives are still maintaining close contacts with Washington, viewing them as a vital security element. Experts note that while Trump's support used to help score political points on the eve of major elections in Europe, it is increasingly becoming an electoral burden. However, scandals surrounding Donald Trump have recently been emerging beyond just international politics. This time, the US president found himself at the center of a controversy over loud claims of alleged vandalism near one of the country's main symbols. Trump claimed that unknown individuals damaged the pool near the Lincoln Memorial, making a multi-meter cut on its surface. According to the US president, this has necessitated additional repairs and even draining the water. However, the administration has yet to release any photos or other evidence. Moreover, journalists who inspected the area found no signs of the damage Trump spoke of. The White House reported that the Department of the Interior is investigating the incident, but there's no confirmation of intentional vandalism yet. This isn't the first such instance. Previously, Trump also claimed alleged intentional damage to structures during the renovation of the White House Rose Garden. But it later turned out that the defects were caused by the contractor's work. So, while European allies increasingly distance themselves from Trump due to his political statements, in the US, new debates are sparked by his accusations, which remain without public proof. The G7 summit has ended, but the internet is still discussing Donald Trump's behavior rather than the leader's decisions. Awkward moments, strange reactions, curious scenes, and a statement that instantly became fodder for thousands of memes. While some talk of political calculation, others ask a much simpler question. What is actually going on with the US president? The most striking episodes of the summit and the online reaction are next. Trump suddenly lost his signature weapon. And no, this time it's not about sanctions or loud statements, but about a handshake. At the G7 summit, Donald Trump shook Emmanuel Macron's hand so limply that body language experts nearly declared a state of emergency. The man who for years turned every handshake into a distinct form of geopolitical struggle suddenly produced what experts called the dead fish effect. It looked especially funny against the backdrop of the two leaders' previous meetings. Previously, Trump liked to literally pull his counterparts to his side, showing who's in charge here. But this time, everything went off script. During the greeting, his hand went limp and dropped, and Macron even tried to lift it up, like a rescuer trying to revive a drowning symbol of American dominance. The most interesting part for experts was the moment just before the handshake. The video shows Trump closing his eyes and avoiding eye contact. One psychologist even suggested it looked as if the American president was silently saying, "God, give me strength." For a man who usually radiates confidence like a bulldozer, the scene turned out to be quite unusual. However, an explanation was found. Experts suggested the reason might be simple: fatigue after a loud birthday celebration. And it seems the now 80-year-old Trump was a bit out of shape.
Handshakes between leaders have long since turned into a separate political genre. Once, it was Trump who set the rules of the game, turning a simple greeting into a show of strength. But this time, the picture turned out to be the opposite. Instead of the traditional who will outpull whom, the world saw a man who looked as if the summit's biggest challenge wasn't international crises, but the desire to just get some sleep. And you must admit, when it comes to a president who loves to show energy and dominance, this in itself sounds like a political joke. But as it turned out, the problem wasn't fatigue at all. Because while the American leader barely had enough strength for the famous dead fish for the French president, for Brigitte Macron, there was energy to spare. During the official photo session, Donald Trump didn't just greet the First Lady of France. According to journalists, he literally skipped past Macron himself to give special attention to Brigitte. Hugs, kisses on both cheeks, smiles, and an exceptionally long handshake that lasted about 14 seconds. Body language experts were most amused by the details of this scene. According to them, the American president demonstrated an almost performative ritual of bonding. Trump touched Brigitte's hand several times, escorted her off the stage, and looked remarkably energetic. It seems that somewhere between the handshakes with Macron and the meeting with his wife, the US president managed to drink something for a boost. And the funniest part is that all this diplomatic theater unfolded right before the eyes of the French president. One expert even joked that Macron looked at that moment as if he were trying to get back into the frame and remind everyone who exactly is the head of state here. But the public's attention had long been fixed on something else. And while analysts look for hidden geopolitical signals, ordinary viewers draw a much simpler conclusion. Perhaps Trump's problem wasn't a lack of energy. It's just that there's much more of it for some people than for others. In the end, the G7 summit risks being remembered not only for talks on wars, sanctions, and global security. Because while some leaders discuss the planet's future, the internet is already excitedly discussing another question. How did it happen that for Macron, Trump only had a dead fish, but for Brigitte, a whole festival of diplomatic tenderness? But these events weren't enough for Mr. Trump. Donald decided to finally reclaim his reputation as the alpha male of world politics. Approaching the negotiating table at the G7 summit, Trump suddenly loudly declared to world leaders, "I'm the boss here."
Hello, I'm actually the boss here.
And he said it so unexpectedly that those present could only laugh. After shouting that he's the boss, Trump also gave a friendly pat on the back to British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, like a CEO who just finished a morning briefing. The most interesting thing is that the reaction of other leaders was surprisingly restrained. It seems that those present are already used to the fact that any summit involving Trump sooner or later turns into a separate show with its own script, jokes, and unexpected improvisations. But the real irony lies elsewhere. While Trump was loudly proclaiming himself the boss, social media was busy discussing completely different footage from the summit. In one of the group photos near the G7 logo, the American president stood a bit apart, while other diplomats chatted among themselves in small groups. And here, a rather funny contrast emerges. Formally, it's "I'm the boss here," but in the frame is a man who seems to have lost his group for a few seconds during a big party. The entire summit increasingly resembles a series about the adventures of a character who refuses to remain just one of the participants in the events. First, everyone discusses his mysterious fatigue next to Macron, then the record-breaking warm interaction with Brigitte Macron, now the loud statement about who's in charge here. And it seems that regardless of the agenda, sanctions, wars, or global crises, Donald Trump once again achieves his main goal, making the whole world talk about his favorite person, himself. However, there is one small problem. The louder a person reminds everyone they're the boss, the more often those around them feel a natural urge to check if that's actually true. And that's exactly why Trump's phrase instantly became one of the most discussed quotes of the summit. After all, in international politics, status is defined not by words, but by whether others are willing to play by your rules. But world leaders are still searching for the answer to that question. Is Trump no longer untouchable? In the US, there's talk of a political crisis that could seriously damage the president's standing. Ratings have slipped, opponents have stepped up, and every new White House decision sparks a wave of controversy. Is America truly approaching a major political reset? And who might end up winning if the situation for Trump continues to worsen? Next, the most interesting part.
A poll by a reputable sociological company conducted across America for the Washington Post showed that the results for the current administration are bleak. Trump's decision to start a war in Iran is disapproved of by 66% of Americans. 76% of those surveyed have felt the rising cost of living. Increased inflation, 72%. 2 out of every 3 Americans dislike America's relationships with its partners. And overall, only 37% approve of President Trump's performance in office. This is a historic low for his 2 terms. And it's not just about the attitude. The midterm elections in the United States are exactly 6 months away, and the ratings are dragging down the chances of re-election to Congress.
Historically, the president's party always loses seats in the midterms, but Republicans currently have such a slim majority in the House, a lead of only 4 votes, that maintaining control is now almost impossible. And now there's such a gap in the ratings that it can't be saved anymore. But they can still try to hold on to the Senate.
Trump knows well what it's like when you don't control the lower house. It was the Speaker at the time, Nancy Pelosi, and the Democrats in control of the House who pushed for impeachment. Back then, only control of the upper chamber, the Senate, saved him, and losing it now would be extremely dangerous for Trump's team, his chosen path, and the president himself. And he'll do everything he can to at least hold on to the Senate. But people vote with their pocketbooks.
Gas prices in the States have jumped from $3 a gallon, which was quite cheap compared to Europe, up to $4. And voters are feeling it at the gas station and through the rising cost of everything else they have to buy.
It's impossible to fix this quickly because it would require ending the war in Iran. But even after it's over, the economy will still be unstable, so they're essentially preparing for a defeat. The Washington Post, citing White House sources, reports that the staff has already begun briefing political appointees in the executive branch. They're being told to prepare for a standoff with lawmakers and for the strictest possible oversight once the Democrats win the midterm elections. So essentially, this is the first public sign that Trump's team isn't just anticipating defeat, but has actually accepted it and will try to save at least the approval rating and political standing of the president himself.
If the war in Iran ends and the economy stabilizes, Trump's personal approval rating could still be pushed up to 40% compared to the current 35%.
And they're trying their absolute hardest. Trump has once again begun talking about the distant political future. At a White House event for small business support, he unexpectedly claimed that when I, say, in 8 or 9 years leave office, I'll be able to benefit from these changes myself. A direct hint that he's not ruling out a 3rd term, which isn't even allowed by the Constitution. But that isn't even the main problem. It's the disappointment of traditional Trump voters who used to forgive him for everything.
This means that today's slogan is no longer America first, but rather, we shouldn't get involved in other people's wars. This definitely has an impact on the president's personal support. It'll be interesting to see where all those votes go if Donald Trump ever steps off the stage.
And in private conversations, he's increasingly asking for advice on who he could hand power to after his term, asking supporters to vote for a successor. Our expert says that among the most likely candidates being mentioned right now is Vice President J.D. Vance. He's a man focused on domestic policy even more so than Trump, and an open skeptic about the need to provide aid to allies. And Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who is gaining more and more influence within the president's inner circle.
His influence can be seen in all the key decisions made by the current administration. He's really toned down his rhetoric compared to how he was speaking a few years ago. And interestingly, Donald Trump is now leaning on him much more than he is on J.D. Vance.
So changes seem inevitable, though not quite as fast as political consultants are predicting. New faces in Congress and likely a new speaker. This is already a potential chance for Ukraine. But on the downside, starting this summer, the states will dive into the election race, trying to save the balance of power in Congress and Trump's personal rating, which, based on recent polls, needs urgent saving. From Washington, Dmytro Anopchenko and Serhiy Koval, American Bureau of Inter-TV Channel for the United News Marathon.
Trump went all in. The US president is effectively putting the Kremlin in a spot where every next step could turn into a problem for Moscow. Negotiations mean playing by a new set of rules. Refusal carries the risk of looking like the side that's avoiding dialogue. While Putin looks for a way out, Trump is more and more actively pushing his own agenda. Is the master of the White House really outplaying the Kremlin on the diplomatic field? And why might Moscow be getting nervous about Washington's new strategy? We're breaking it down right now. Trump is pulling Putin into negotiations in the US, and this could be a trap the Kremlin won't be able to escape. Donald Trump supports the idea of a three-way meeting with Zelensky, Putin, and the US on American soil. The idea is simple and tough. Either Putin sits down to negotiate under pressure from Washington, or he openly shows the world he's running from dialogue. The Kremlin finds itself in a dead end. Before, they easily made up excuses. The wrong format, the wrong venue, the wrong time. But now everything is different. When the US and Trump personally are the initiators, any refusal looks like a political escape. Zelensky is directly ramping up this pressure. A format in the US led by Trump isn't just negotiations anymore. It's a public stage for the whole world. Agree, and you answer for the war directly. Refuse, and your escape becomes obvious to everyone. If Moscow turns down this chance too, the conversation could move to a different level, one of additional pressure. And then for the Kremlin, the problem won't be the meeting place or the negotiation format anymore. Then they'll have to answer for their refusal to find a way out of a war that's costing Russia itself more and more. And that is a completely different level of discomfort. For years, the Kremlin built an image of a strong geopolitical player who dictates terms to others. But now the situation risks turning into a political joke. Every time there's a chance to sit at the negotiating table, the Russian side finds a new reason to stay as far away from it as possible. And the more often this happens, the louder the world asks, who is actually afraid of negotiations? Especially since this is far from the first attempt to get the Kremlin to the negotiating table. Even earlier, Volodymyr Zelensky proposed holding a meeting with Putin on the sidelines of the G7 summit, with the participation of the world's leading democratic nations. One would think that for a man who's spent years talking about his readiness for peace and dialogue, this was a perfect chance to prove his words. But the result was predictable. The Russian leader refused to take part. As soon as a real platform for negotiations appears, the Kremlin instantly finds new reasons not to attend. First, a reluctance to meet with Zelensky, then a lack of interest in the G7 format. Now, a new proposal is already on the table, a meeting in the USA involving Donald Trump. And the impression is growing that the problem for Moscow isn't the location of the negotiations or even their format. After all, the longer this diplomatic game of hide-and-seek continues, the louder the awkward question becomes. If the Kremlin truly seeks peace, then why does its leader so persistently avoid a face-to-face conversation? A man who likes to project the image of a fearless geopolitical player has been unable for several years in a row to find time for a meeting that is supposed to bring the end of the war closer. And if Putin also refuses the American format promoted by Zelensky and Trump, it will become much harder to make excuses. Because sooner or later, the world may reach a simple conclusion. Perhaps it's not Kyiv or the West running away from negotiations, as the main record holder for avoiding peace meetings sits right in the Kremlin. Earlier, Zelensky had already used a very direct diplomatic signal to Putin, an open public letter with a proposal to end the war and a personal meeting. This was not just a political gesture, but an attempt to bring the conversation to the level of a direct challenge, either dialogue or a final confirmation of the Kremlin's unwillingness to conduct it. A special emphasis was placed on the fact that Ukraine does not want an endless war and sees a real chance for its conclusion. Zelensky directly stated that the majority of Russians could supposedly also support the idea of ending hostilities, and that rejecting this path is a deliberate continuation of escalation that has already gone far beyond the Kremlin's initial expectations. In fact, it was a call to exit the war, which sounded like a political warning. It is important that the format of negotiations in this letter was immediately taken beyond the borders of Ukraine and Russia. Neutral countries, including Switzerland, Turkey, or Middle Eastern states, were named as possible venues. Ukraine also stated its readiness in the event of a real dialogue to consider a temporary cessation of hostilities and the involvement of the USA and Europe in the process. Thus, this letter became another stage of diplomatic pressure, an attempt to move the war from the battlefield to the plane of direct political responsibility. And if new formats of negotiations involving the USA are being discussed today, then this step looks like a preliminary signal. Kyiv is consistently trying to pull the Kremlin into a direct dialogue, changing the level and scale of pressure. One cannot ignore the story of Roman Abramovich, who secretly came to see Zelensky for closed-door negotiations. The irony is that negotiation channels sometimes turn out to be more alive than official ones. And while Russian television talks about a monolithic vertical, in reality this vertical has long resembled a network of separate cables that are themselves looking for where to connect so as not to be left without power. And from within these corridors, people from the inner circle of the Russian elite suddenly emerge, who for some reason prefer to speak not through the Kremlin, but around it. The situation is quite amusing. Officially, no negotiations, no concessions. We dictate the terms. Unofficially, business intermediaries are quietly knocking on various doors, looking for even a small window for agreements. The topic of negotiations has long gone beyond the scope of ordinary diplomacy and turned into a political test of readiness for responsibility. The United States, through a potential format involving Trump, is effectively raising the stakes to the maximum. Either Putin comes to a public conversation about the war, or the world records his refusal as a deliberate avoidance of dialogue. And against this backdrop, every new initiative, from the G7 to the American platform, only narrows the room for maneuver, leaving the Kremlin with fewer neutral formulations and more uncomfortable questions without answers. And how do you feel about these events? Write your opinion in the comments, hit the like button under the video, and stay up to date with the main news. More to come. See you in the next report.